You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 4th of October 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Emma Nelson, and coming up on today's programme, the EU votes just to impose tariffs on Chinese electric cars. We'll find out why it's turned into a battle over Europe's manufacturing future. Also coming up, protesters in Argentina fight to retain funding for the country's universities. President Milei says the money could be better spent. Plus,
today is a day of mourning for the Czechoslovakian people, like myself, like the vast majority, because we've been excluded from those negotiations, and they decided the fate of the island, the future of the island, without even consulting the population.
The UK hands the Chagos Islands back to Mauritius. Residents complain about being left out of the decision, and fears are raised about the security implications. We'll look at a legacy of problems, and we'll enjoy a roundup of the latest theatre news too. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. In the last couple of hours, the EU has voted on whether to impose tariffs on electric vehicles imported from China. The issue has split the European Union's two biggest economies, France and Germany. France is keen to impose tariffs. Germany has much less so. And this split has been reflected in the result of the vote. To find out exactly what's happened, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Tim Urquhart, Principal Automotive Analyst at S&P Global Mobility. Good afternoon, Tim.
Good afternoon.
So, in simple terms, what's just happened?
Well, as you say, the EU has voted to impose a range of tariffs. And it's not just one level of tariff. Basically, this started in 2023, if I remember correctly, when the European Commission, obviously the legal arm of the European Union, started an in-depth investigation into what it suspected was tariffs, subsidies on Chinese vehicles that were being imported to Europe, basically creating an unfair playing field. And these subsidies amounted to all kinds of different things, from sales tax exemptions, approved buying rates, government funding for infrastructure, such as charging stations, as well as government procurement for EVs, support for R&D programs. It all mounted up over a long period of time. Going back 15 years to 2009. One study suspects that the electric vehicle manufacturers in China were advantaged to the tune collectively of $231 billion. So that's quite a slanted playing field. And suddenly it's become an issue because in the last sort of 18 months, 2 years, there's been an increase in Chinese BEV exports into Europe. And these cars are good cars, they're high-quality cars. And the EU is concerned that these cars being brought in to be sold in the European Union are not competing on a level playing field with cars made in Europe.
This was not an easily won vote for the likes of Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU Commission, because the vote was split here, wasn't it? I mean, we had the likes of the Swedish Minister for Foreign Trade saying that we're getting positive signals from the Commission that they can go ahead with individual solutions for the auto agency, is that they need China and the EU to come together for an agreement in relation to this problem. So the Swedes are saying, look, we need to work with China, not against China. We have the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban in customary noisy mode, saying what they're making us do right now is an economic Cold War. We have the Germans who did not want it to happen. We had the likes of Emmanuel Macron who was saying that this is a threat to the future of European manufacturing if the Chinese are allowed to flood the market. I mean, what does this say about the state of Europe and its ability to navigate, A, the retention of manufacturing on its own soil, but B, as you say, the introduction of some very good cars that are coming from China, which the European consumer is going to want to buy?
Well, as you just outlined, there are very, very big splits in the EU, and very big splits in the sort of fundamental philosophies of how to approach this issue. You know, what this is against sort of the status quo of the past 30, 40, 50 years of global free trade, and it should be allowed within reason. Obviously, there are small tariffs here and there. Obviously, there was a pre-existing 10% tariff, as you just said. People have different ideas. Obviously, the likes of Viktor Orban want to maintain close ties with China and open communication and free trade. Germany thinks it's a threat to their car manufacturers because they will face almost certain reciprocal tariffs on their very high-end luxury vehicle imports into China, thus hurting the profits of the likes of Porsche, BMW, Mercedes. France and Spain and countries like that don't have the same issue. They don't export a lot of high-end vehicles to China like Germany, so they've got more to suffer. Same with Italy as well. So it's about a philosophical approach, some sort of self-interest, and possibly starting to sort of see cracks within, especially the big five European Union countries.
Tim, explain to us a little more about why China seems to be so good at making electric vehicles at an accessible price at all scale, from the small compact vehicles to the bigger cars, whereas the European Union, Europe in general, has no shortage of outstanding car manufacturers and car designers right across the bloc, and yet the European Union does not seem to have got its act together, or European manufacturers don't seem to be moving as quickly as China.
Yeah, I think it goes back to China's obviously fundamental technological capabilities, their ability to innovate. They've obviously got a huge tech industry there, and their ability to combine sort of new industries, technology, telecommunications industries with, legacy industries like car making. It is incredibly impressive, the pace at which they've improved their capabilities. I think the big impetus for China was they were very early on in making legislation to sort of mandate electric vehicles, especially in cities, called the New Energy Vehicle Policy. It's not like the EU, which is quite a cumbersome body made up of 27 different parties. It's the Chinese government that can impose these things. Obviously, there's different big city authorities in China, but basically the central government calls the shots. So that's the New Energy Vehicle Policy was born about 10 years ago, and that's definitely been a factor in accelerating electric vehicle take-up in China.
How much does China need the European Union as a market?
It does need it as a market, and I think it's sort of eyeing it as a market that has a lot of potential for growth. But we're a forecasting business ostensibly. When you look at the forecast numbers for vehicle imports to Chinese BEVs, they're not that, even before the tariffs, they weren't that huge. So I think it was always going to be a slow build-up over quite a long period of time. But I think the EU is taking this standpoint that it's just not fair that, these cars are going to be imported, and having had all these subsidies in every aspect of their creation, companies have been helped, whether it's through, incentives to buy the vehicles or the Chinese government buying the vehicles. It's not really a level playing field, and lots of scope for these companies to take market share relatively quickly, but also in a shrinking European market share, which is ever increasingly competitive, and which is going through its own electric transformation, which the European OEMs are already struggling with at the moment. So it's a bit of a perfect storm for the European car makers.
Tim Murcutt, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. The time here in London is 9 minutes past midday. You're with The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. A quick look now at the day's other news stories. Here's Anita Riotta.
Thanks, Emma. Iran's supreme leader has issued a strong warning, stating that Tehran and its regional allies will not back down from confronting Israel. This comes just hours after an Israeli strike in Beirut, reportedly targeting the likely successor to Hezbollah's assassinated leader. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei made a rare public appearance during Friday prayers, his first sermon in nearly 5 years. President Joe Biden has congratulated dock workers for ending a strike that threatened the U.S. supply chain weeks before the election. The union, representing tens of thousands of East Coast dock workers, announced a tentative wage agreement extending their contract until January. White House officials credit weeks of behind-the-scenes talks and President Biden's efforts to pressure shipping companies into a deal. A British woman has been honoured for boosting ties between the UK and Japan through marmalade. Jane Hassel-McCosh, who runs the Dalmain World Marmalade Awards in Cumbria, was praised by Japan's government for welcoming Japanese visitors and supporting a marmalade festival in the country. Those are our headlines. Back to you, Emma.
And you're back with the briefing on Monocle Radio. The streets of central Buenos Aires were filled with protesters earlier this week, determined to protect the budget of Argentina's universities. It's the second time in the last 6 months that demonstrations have taken place. The country's president, Javier Milei, has promised to inflict deep cuts on public spending in order to balance the country's books, and the universities are included in this plan. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined now by Andrew Thompson, who's a Latin American specialist and Latin news contributor. A very good afternoon to you, Andrew.
Hello, good afternoon.
So just explain to us, to Argentinians, how sacred is their education system?
I suppose the answer is pretty sacred. The country has had free universal education, including in particular university education, for decades, and it's widely seen as, one of the great social advances made in the 20th century. They now believe that under the budget cutting Javier Milei, this is under threat, and they are true, they are correct. He is seeking massive budget cutbacks.
And tell us a little bit about just how much these budget cutbacks would affect the educational system. And it's prompted people to take to the streets about this, because there's a fear, isn't there, that if the budgets are slashed hard, then it will prevent people who ordinarily would not be able to afford an education from doing so.
Correct. You'd see a big shift towards private universities fee paying, which a small proportion of the Argentine population can afford, but the vast mass cannot afford. I think there's one important thing to say to put this in context. Inflation in Argentina in the month that Milei took office was 25% in 1 month. Since then, by cutting the budget, radically reducing the fiscal deficit, there's now a fiscal surplus, he's managed to reduce inflation to 4% a month. In these kind of circumstances, the annual inflation rate to this month is about 230%. So in these circumstances, if you do nothing, people's wages shrink in real terms because they're not keeping up with inflation. And that's what's in fact happened in the university sector, where university lecturers and staff in general are 24% poorer in real terms than they were when Milei took office. So it's a very, very big issue.
There's also the fact that it's not just university staff who are feeling the economic pains of very high and very rapidly increasing inflation. What is the general public view towards these protests?
The general public is deeply, deeply divided and remains divided since Milei took office last December. To give you an example, there's a pollster called Proyección, which in the month of September found that Milei had a 44.8% approval rating and a 50.7% disapproval rating. So in the context of the vast and painful changes he's making, those figures show that there is a degree of resilience in his support. And I think for that group of Argentine society, government after government in the past has made populist promises and failed to deliver. So there is still a degree of sympathy for the radical outsider, the slightly Trump-like figure who's going to cut back everything, and who during the election campaign had himself photographed wielding a chainsaw to kind of embody this complete reduction and complete change in government finances.
And indeed, despite the fact that university funding has been frozen for 2024 at the same level as last year, and there are people taking to the streets trying to make sure that this budget is nonetheless protected. We have, Javier Milei, increasing funding for university hospitals and also for infrastructure. So he is arguably demonstrating that the money that he takes from one sector of society is going somewhere else. I mean, how effective a plan is this?
It's effective in the sense that it has generated a fiscal surplus for the last 9 months, which is the first in recent Argentine history, at least the first in the last 20 years. So at that level, it's successful, but he is going to have extreme difficulty in carrying the population with him. Although he's got those people who are supporting his radical actions, there is in effect, another half of Argentina, which is saying this represents the dismantling of the welfare state, and we are not going to accept it. And it has to be said that it's not that cuts in one area are offset by extra spending in another. The overall picture is a very sharp reduction in the public deficit, and he's arguing that in the case of the universities, you can't protect university funding from inflation without at the same time saying where you're going to find the money. So he's rejected the bill, he's vetoed the bill that would protect universities, and he says that you have to discuss this in the context of the 2025 government budget, which is under discussion in Congress.
Who's going to win this argument? Because you mentioned Congress there, but Milei has a minority inside Congress, and there is a possibility that Congress could just simply overrule Milei's plans.
There is that possibility, but I think the balance of probabilities is that he's going to win this particular tussle. The way it works in Argentina, a president can veto a bill approved by Congress, which is what's happened, but Congress can only change things further if it gets a 2/3 majority. So it's quite possible that there is not the 2/3 majority to resolve this issue. And like pension reforms beforehand, Milei will be able to keep to his hard line. In other words, a majority of Congress is against him, but the majority falls short of the 2/3 supermajority that's needed.
Andrew Thompson, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Briefing. The British government has rejected claims that it has put the UK's security at risk by agreeing to give sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. The Foreign Office Minister said the UK had been given a very clear guarantee to ensure national security interests were protected on the archipelago. Well, Tara O'Connor is Managing Director of Africa Risk Consulting, a Pan-African risk management company. Tara, welcome back to Monocle. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Just explain the background to this, because the deal comes after about, the good part of half a century of wrangling over this archipelago.
Yes, it's an Indian Ocean island, clump of islands that were once administered with, when Mauritius was under British colonial rule, they were administered together. And I think probably about 20 years ago, the Mauritian Labour government actually launched a campaign to actually lay claim to the sovereignty of the Chagos Islands, and they have been successful. It's been, a long and hard-won battle, but one that had the full support of both most of African countries were fully behind it, and most of the various governments that have different governments that have come into power in Mauritius have also been very supportive of it.
What is their strategic importance?
So they are an Indian Ocean clump of islands that have become, I think, very important, particularly to Western strategic interests, because the island of Diego Garcia, some 50 years ago, was handed over to to the US to build a military facility there. And, for example, attacks on Iraq and Iraq and Afghanistan were launched from that base. So it's also a very important point. There's been a lot of commentary about why it's important that it may now become a target for China to actually build a base there. But that's not likely. Mauritius has very strong relations really with India, and India has already built a jetty and a landing strip on one of the Mauritian islands.
Tell us about the military aspect as well, because one of the largest islands, Diego Garcia, will remain for 99 years a US-UK military base. It is expected to remain so for the entirety of that duration, and there is the prospect of renewing. I mean, the fact that it's now in the hands of the Mauritius, how does that alter things?
So, the opposition in Mauritius criticised this deal on particularly this point. I think the International Court of Justice and the UN General Assembly rulings in 2019 basically instructed the UK government to cede sovereignty immediately and not in this qualified manner. But it's a classic sort of let's get this deal done fudge between two countries. And so technically, the land is now leased to the UK government to continue to exercise the military right to have a military base there, but under a technical sovereignty of Mauritius. So effectively, nothing will change, and there is a 99-year lease which is renewable in the next century. So it secures that military base into the next century and is actually a very good deal for the Americans and for the Brits. Not so great for the opposition in Mauritius, who are very critical of it. They also want to understand what the financial implications of the lease deal are, in particular where that money is going to go, how it's going to be paid to the Mauritian government, which has been also accused by the opposition of not being transparent.
And how about the residents of Chagos Islands themselves? There has been a significant amount of complaint from those who say that despite the reassurances from the British and the Mauritian authorities, that they were not consulted and they were not part of this agreement.
Yes, the difficulty is obviously because the deal has to be done between sovereign states and according to the ICJ. So Chagosans unfortunately were excluded from that, and they are the victims of this extraordinary last vestige of British colonialism, because they've been relegated to sort of 50 years of quasi-statelessness in the Seychelles, UK, and indeed in Mauritius. So I think, there will be opposition to this, but I think overall, it's a pretty much a win-win deal for all.
Tara O'Connor, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You were the briefing. Time now for a look at the world of theatre. And Matt Wolfe, theatre critic at the International New York Times. I've said good afternoon, Matt.
Good afternoon to you,
As he came in, we're going to be talking about Waiting for Godot. And as I walked in, I said, are we the Vladimir and Estragon of radio or theatre?
Yes, do not move. We'll never go home.
I never go to the theatre. This is what's so funny. I sit here, like everyone, and I talk to in a great expectation to Matt that, that there will be a trip to the theatre one day.
So the theatre for you is like Godot, forever out of reach.
Effectively, yes. So there's anyway.
Well, if you are going to change your mind and take the plunge...
Where are we going? That's beautifully pivoted there, young man. Where are we going today?
We try. This is a good production with which to venture out into the brave, cruel world of the West End, because actually, I mean, I love Waiting for Godot, but it doesn't always land. It can seem opaque or abstruse or actually just a bit dull.
Oh, it sort of looks at itself it looks at itself in the wrong way.
Yeah, but this production with Ben Whishaw and Lucien Samati
is
absolutely lovely. Directed by James MacDonald, who does a lot of new plays at the Royal Court. And I think you feel that with this production, that he's brought a really forensic attention to text, to a play that we think we know, but actually we probably don't. It's about these two tramps sort of in existential limbo. And I think for a lot of people, the play is sort of, A-level homework, or feels like it.
It does feel like that. Why is it so good
this production, it's funny, it's racy, it's very moving. And what it catches is both the tenderness between Didi and Gogo, the two sort of tramps at the heart of it, but also there's a kind of terror underpinning it. What is this life beyond? Is this just a way station before death? But if it is, then they might as well respond with as much kindness and care and compassion as they can. And at the curtain call, when the two leading men sort of took each other's hands in a very impromptu manner, which I think the audience noticed, it was very lovely. There are two wonderful supporting players, Jonathan Slinger and Tom Eden. They play Patso and Lucky, who are this sort of itinerant master-slave couple who come into view, and they are absolutely remarkable.
When you think about it, it is the oddest play ever written. You talked about the master-slave thing, and then you have the two tramps who don't do anything, and yet it still absolutely grips us.
Well, because every playwright who's come after Tom Stoppard, obvious example, but Carol Church and many others, say that Beckett changed the parameters of how playwrights can write and think. It's famously described as the play in which nothing happens twice, because at the end of the second act, you're exactly where you were at the end of the first act. Godot hasn't arrived. They're still waiting. He'll come tomorrow, or does he even exist? But actually, the French title, Beckett, although Irish, wrote the play originally in French because he was living in Paris, en attendant Godot, while waiting for Godot. And you really get the feeling that it doesn't matter whether Godot comes or who he is. What happens is life in the moment and how we live it.
Worth seeing them.
Very much so.
Absolutely. I should go and queue for a ticket and wonder whether it'll ever happen.
I dread to think about that nice performance. Anyway, go ahead.
Fortunately, Samuel Beckett's not still with us for me to tell him.
Exactly.
Okay, what else is happening while we're waiting for that?
Lots of dyspeptic leading men. At the Royal Court, we have in interesting plays. We've got Giant, which does have a giant of an American actor, John Lithgow, both in terms of renown, but also he's very, very tall, playing Roald Dahl. And this is a new play by Mark Rosenblatt, better known as a director, now turned first-time playwright, brought to the Royal Court by the always accomplished Sir Nicholas Heitner, who runs the Bridge, but the Bridge is busy with Guys and Dolls, so he's brought this play to the Royal Court. And it's about a charge of anti-Semitism charges that were leveled against Roald Dahl about 40-odd years ago when he penned a book review that caused great controversy at the time. And he's met at his country home by his British publisher, Tom Mashley, who actually does exist, and an American publisher who in the play is fictional. And they try to get him to recant. And what's very interesting is so much of what he talks about, the Roald Dahl character talks about, is absolutely pertinent to what's happening now. Israel, Lebanon, Gaza, the debate, the tensions expressed in the script could absolutely be taking place today.
What about this idea of unpicking legacies of much beloved characters?
Well, I think what actually the play does very cleverly is it doesn't disavow the art because of the artist. What it suggests is that actually both can and should coexist. In a funny way, it's sort of anti-cancel culture. It says that, greatness of writing and literary output can be contemporaneous with, questionable views, or at least a sort of recalcitrance in the public eye, from which Dahl is absolutely unyielding, we think, although there's an interesting twist at the end of the play, which I don't want to give away. But in the play, he's an angry old man, the Dahl character. And in Look Back in Anger, another program, at the Almeida, it's a play about a famous 1956 play about the angry young man, Jimmy Porter. And Jimmy Porter, this was a play in its day as famous as Waiting for Godot. Jimmy Porter exists to rant. He's vituperative, vitriolic, mean-spirited, but he's also damaged, hurt, and haunted. And what this production, directed by Atri Banerjee, does very, very well is not celebrate Jimmy Porter, but critique him. and it's very, very well done by Billy Howell, who plays the part, and Laura Turchia, who plays his put-upon wife Alison, who in this production has a lot to say for herself.
It's an interesting, just looking more generally at the sort of the plate of offerings that you've brought in today. We have Waiting for Godot, typical A-level text.
Yeah.
You have Roots by Arnold Wesker, typical A-level text.
Look
John
Back in
Osborne's
Anger.
We've all done it.
And then a brand new play about something 40-odd years ago.
Indeed. But the interesting thing I found there, that we're in the autumn.
Yep.
Has someone looked at the syllabus? Does this happen every single year?
Well,
We've got to get bums on seats.
You know where that does happen, actually, is with Shakespeare plays. You'll think, why are there so many productions of Macbeth? And it's, oh, that's why. And you think, oh, that's the set text or a Chekhov. What's fascinating is some of these plays seem to be in the theatre where you wouldn't expect them. So Look Back in Anger and Roots began at the Royal Court. They're being done at the Almeida. Giant feels like it could be an Almeida play commissioned by the Bridge. It's been done at the Royal Court. Everything is sort of moving around. But, there's been so much, I say this as an American living in London, there's been so much American stuff in London this year. I'm really glad to see some British and Irish plays again. I was beginning to worry.
And do they retain their place in the canon with justification?
I don't think they necessarily do, but I think in these productions they very much earn their keep and suggest a way forward. I mean, looking at both Roots and Look Back in Anger, there's a kind of fury to them that I think is at large in the world today. Okay,
so if you had one evening, one opportunity, and you had to go among either Giant, Roots, Look Back in Anger, or Godot, which one are you going for?
Godot.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Matt Wolfe, theatre critic at the International New York Times. Are you Vladimir or Estragon?
Oh, I'm definitely Estragon.
Excellent. Okay. I wanted to be Estragon.
We can both be.
Okay, that's all the time we have for today's edition of The Briefing. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producer, Anita Riotta. Our researchers were Gunnar Grunled and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing is back on Monday at the same time, but for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great weekend.